Hello, my name is Ian St John, a history teacher from England, and in the next few minutes I'd like to summarise for you the main arguments of Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition, which was published in 1958. Now this book was Arendt's most sustained piece of social philosophy, and in it she posed the question, what does it mean to be a human being in the world? Now there were, said Arendt, two ways in which human beings engage with the world. First of all, we think about it, and secondly, we act upon it. Now according to Arendt, most philosophers and thinkers through history have tended to focus upon how people have thought about the world. And therefore in this book she sought to redress that by focusing much more on how people act in the world, act upon the world. What she called human action, or the vita activa. So let's look at what Hannah Arendt understands by human action. Well, there were, said Arendt, three types of human action. The first was labour. Now for Arendt, labour means the biologically necessary repetitive process of perpetuating human life as a biological species. We're talking here about things like the preparation of food, the gathering of harvest, cleaning, washing, growing crops, making babies, bringing up children, and so on. These activities are a basic and repetitive necessity if life is to be sustained at all. This, of course, is therefore not a distinctively human form of action. All animals essentially go through the same processes. And so that's her first form of action, labour, effort to perpetuate the human species. The second type of action Arendt talks about is work. And for Arendt, work is where humans posit a goal and then set about realising it through kind of purposeful action. By this she primarily means the production of durable goods, the things that inhabit our world, things like pots and pans, tables, chairs, books, computers, the basic paraphernalia of stuff which surrounds us. And Arendt believes this action of work to make directed outcomes of durable products is an essentially human form of activity, and it makes the stable structure, the foundation really by which we live our daily lives. She calls this the worldliness of our lives. And it's the the everyday framework within which we operate as human beings, and as I say, it is distinctively a human creation. Another feature of work is that it is fixed in its goal and outcome, whereas labour is a perpetual process of repetition. In work, we perceive of an activity, we realise it, and then we kind of stop. So an example of that would be, you might say, well, I've got a set of trees here, I need to clear a woodland. I know I'll make an axe. I will formulate the idea of an axe. I will make an axe. I will then use that axe to go and chop down trees. I won't then make axe after axe after axe. I'll simply make the products I require as a kind of goal-directed endeavour. That is the essential nature of work as far as Arendt is concerned. The last form of action she considers is one very particular to her, and she calls it, she said, she calls it action. Now, action is something which she regards as something as freely initiated activity done in the public sphere, where the outcome of this activity is unknown in advance, is unpredictable. Action is always creative. It makes new worlds. It's always free in the sense that it's not biologically necessary to act with others, to interact with others and initiate things. It produces things which are unique. Now, all human beings are unique. No two people have ever been the same ever. And this is even more the case, obviously, when two unique people interact to make something happen, because everything that's ever kind of socially activated in this way has never been seen before, ever. Another feature of action is that it's closely allied with speech, because when we act with others to do things, we almost by necessity explain what we're doing, justify what we're doing, say what we're going to do, say we've done it. And so action for Arendt is closely and inextricably wrapped up with language and talking about what we are doing. Now, I say for Arendt then, action is the most quintessentially human form of endeavour. And there are two things about it that are profoundly important in her system that you need to bear in mind. The first is that action discloses the reality of what it means to be a human being as such. When we initiate a unique action, we are always revealing something about ourselves by the decision of what to do, by the way in which we explain it to others, by the way in which we debate with others to win over people to our point of view. When we act in this way, we are disclosing our character as human beings. And we each of us do that when we act, and therefore even more when a group of people act, so they disclose the nature of the society that they have created or are inhabiting. And so action for Arendt is revelatory. And you might think, for example, here of a politician. A politician, when they disclose, this is Arendt's argument, Arendt says that a politician discloses their character by, obviously, what things they prioritise, what objectives they have, or policies they endorse. They do it also by the language they use, the arguments they give, the way they appear in public, the way they respond to questions. All these things that a politician does all the time are revelatory of who they are as people. And it follows from this that the more people participate in the public sphere and the greater array of viewpoints and perspectives that they articulate there, then the greater the degree to which reality as human beings is revealed. So action is revelatory of what it means to be humans in Arendt's perspective, and the more human action there is, the more we reveal, therefore, the essential nature of the human condition as we live and experience it. That's the first thing about action. The second thing about action is that its consequences are unpredictable and have no end point. When we initiate an action, we have no idea how it will play out. Yes, I perceive of what I want to achieve. I decide to get up into a forum, make a speech, arguing for something, e.g. to go to war with Sparta or something. I get up and make a speech. I then, in a way, set the ball rolling. But then other people respond to my initiated action with their own actions in response to mine. And those actions in turn produce multiple further reactions amongst other people, and I further react to them, with the result that my initial action kind of ripples on through history, triggering off a myriad of other actions by other people. And therefore, the person who initially initiates the action can have no knowledge in advance of how, in fact, it will end. Indeed, it cannot even be clearly said when it has ended, because one never knows which action precipitates another and another. It's a kind of continuous stream of consequences. So at what point we say the thing has ended is clearly pretty arbitrary and is never exactly clear to the participants in it. Arendt says that the actor can never know the outcome of that action. Really only the historian can. The historian can because, in theory, they can look back over events and kind of form a kind of view of how they've unfolded and consequences, but the people making them can never know the narrative of the lives in a way they are wrapped up in and living. And of course, a great example of this would be David Cameron's decision to initiate a Brexit referendum on Britain's relationship to the European Union. When he did that, of course, he had no idea what would happen, in the sense that he thought that the vote would be to remain, the vote then was to leave. That then caused Cameron to resign, it caused Theresa May to come in. That's caused all the eruptions of the last 2.5 years in politics, and still we don't know the outcome even of Cameron's initial decision. And of course we won't really know the outcome in terms of the impact of Britain, possibly of leaving the European Union, for decades to come. And so the outcome of action is never known and is never final. It kind of merges with the stream of human experience and action, history. Given this, action is actually quite daunting for human beings because, as I say, they can't know what will happen, and they trigger events they cannot foresee. And to deal with this, Arendt says that humans evolve two mechanisms. The first one is the idea of forgiveness. Because I cannot know what my action will precipitate, I cannot know by definition the bad stuff that will happen along the way. None of us therefore really can be held responsible for the bad things, our actions, because they're not foreseeable in advance. And therefore humans can cope with this fact with the practice of forgiveness. And she mentions really, or she cites here the case of Jesus Christ, who she regards as the individual who brings the concept of forgiveness into kind of mainstream civilization. We all think of Christ's prayer, for example, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Jesus Christ brought a kind of an ethic of forgiveness, turning the cheek, and whereas this was in contrast to the Old Testament, which had an ethic of retribution, an eye for an eye. Here there is no closure, because I do a bad act, then you extract revenge by doing a bad act on me, and so this cycle is repeated through history. Whereas Jesus Christ says, I do a bad thing, you forgive me, and that therefore opens the future to free possibilities rather than the closed cycle of retribution in the Old Testament. The second thing humans do to cope with the unpredictable nature of action is the concept of promises. We seek to gain some closure on the future by making promises about it. So I will promise or a business may promise, next year we will deliver X amount of stuff at X price to X other firm. And by making pledges like this, we can to a degree control and shape the consequence of our actions. And Arendt says that these promises are important for humans because it basically gives us a greater capacity for collective action. Without it, we'll all be basically kind of triggering off chain effects of actions, but we wouldn't be able to coordinate the future or to continue to unfold. Whereas a promise gives us the capacity to unite around a fixed object, and that greatly empowers societies to achieve things. So the second feature then by which we deal with unpredictability is the concept of the promise. Now, in Arendt's book, she really kind of has a kind of schematic history, of civilization wrapped up in it. And she begins by really saying that for most human beings through most of history, the basic form of action has been labour, in the sense that the basic task of human beings has been to maintain, life on Earth, essentially. So labour has been the dominant form of human action, the repetitive process of sustaining life. Now, in early societies, the low productivity of labour essentially meant that if anybody was to participate in non-labour activities, and above all action, i.e. free initiated social endeavours in the public space, then they required really to be a body of slaves who would work on their behalf. So the slaves would do the labour, freeing up others to do other stuff like work, or more importantly, action. And for Arendt, the paradigm of this is the Greek city-state. Because in the Greek city-state, the kind of adult male citizen would have in his home labour. And this labour was done by slaves and by the women of the household and probably the children. They would be doing the labour of the business of reproducing the family at home. And then the male would step forward from the threshold of the home into the public forum, and there take his place with other free, equal adult males, and would then engage in political action, speeches, debates, arguments, discussions, formulation of policy, and so on. So therefore there's a clear dichotomy between labour and action, and a clear kind of class and gender rigidity to enforce that. Now, over time, Arendt suggests that in place of this labour action kind of dichotomy, there was a gradual growth in the prevalence of work. I.e., over time, more people began to be engaged in kind of self-directed activity to realise an objective in the form of, for example, making something like a tool, an instrument, a house, and such like. And so for a time, Arendt kind of says, it looks like humans are going to be defined essentially as working species. But this did not in fact happen, and because what then intruded was the growth of the division of labour. Now, the division of labour was a kind of discovery that if you take the processes of work or labour and subdivide them, then human productivity can be greatly unleashed. And this meant that this became the kind of the general character of society, which is that tasks were subdivided in terms of like functionality, and within a business, within division of labour within that as well. And the result of this was that, in a way, labour left the home, it entered society, and the upshot is that individuals ceased to be engaged in making particular objects, but instead became cogs in a system of collective labour in the form of social division of labour. The effect of this, as far as Arendt is concerned, is it really debases human activity and returns us paradoxically once again to the condition of labourers, because an individual who simply goes to work to operate a machine is engaged in the repetitive, pointless, futile, kind of meaningless, necessary labour, which is exactly the kind of labour that defined early civilizations or human societies in the form of the basic business of sustaining life. And so, in a way, the meaning was sucked out of work. It was made repetitive. It became process-driven, and the individual simply became a component in a system, the meaning of which was somewhere beyond themselves. And so, therefore, we became what Arendt calls job holders. In the modern world, we just hold down a job. We go out, we do it every day, we do the same thing every day to keep the machine running. Now, this machine then in turn is massively productive, so it generates huge amounts of quantity of materials, and it can only be sustained if these materials are then basically used and discarded. So again, in the paradigm of work, somebody would make an object like an axe, and this axe would then have multiple uses for years, maybe even generations. The same axe or tool will be passed on. In modern society with mass production, this is unsustainable, because then there'll be no market to consume stuff. So essentially we produce a mass consumption society where most things are used and discarded. So things have a short product kind of life cycle. And once again, Arendt's basically saying is that consumption becomes almost like labour. We work at simply consuming our way through the vast amount of stuff we get through every day. So every day we spend half the day in our production processes, churning out products in a kind of conveyor belt of detailed action, and in the evening, or once we finish work, we then engage in mass consumption, the business of simply consuming the stuff we've made in our work jobs. So in a way we become slaves both simultaneously to production and also to consumption. So essentially then, the modern society, as Arendt understands it, is a labouring society. Now there is, however, still, she argues, work in this society, and there's still action. But the main area, interestingly, that she says these two things go on is actually in science. Science, she says, becomes the refuge really of work, because in science, the scientist designs an experiment, they fabricate the particular tools necessary to do that experiment through work. You may think here, for example, of Galileo's telescope, which is the example she gives. You might think also of, say, the Hadron Collider. This is a kind of artisanal kind of activity. And also, when scientists do their experiments and they interact with nature using the products of work, they initiate actions, which the outcomes cannot be predicted. So, for example, when humans first maybe, for example, split the atom or unlock the power of nuclear energy, they could not foresee what the consequence of that will be, and we still cannot foresee that. And so science is the main refuge, she argues, for work and action, whereas the economy has become dominated by labour, the repetitive process of keeping life going. Now, let me summarise Arendt's perspective then on the human condition now. Well, first, as I said, we live in an age of mass labouring. Labour dominates our lives, both in terms of production and consumption. We are each of us then reduced to small cogs in a vast economic machine. The consequence of this is that our lives become personally meaningless. What we are doing is not of any direct meaning to us or particular importance, and we're kind of interchangeable, as in the system of production, we're interchangeable parts. If one worker breaks down, loses his job, whatever, another one can equally replace that. The essential product of that then is alienation, because we are no longer living in a world which is meaningful to us. The life that we do, the actions that we have, are meaningless in our experience of them. So the basic characteristic then is we live in an alienated existence. Equally, the world we are making is no longer a kind of a stable structure within which to be human. Everything is in flux. Everything is made and thrown away. There's very little durability in our world, mainly just disposability, and the kind of engine of production is such that it consumes the natural world around it at an ever accelerating rate, as our current environmental movement is drawing attention to. So we are in a way alienated in our own work lives. We are alienated from our own domestic existence, which is no longer one to which we can attach traditional meaning, and even the world of nature has been reduced either to a mathematical equation of scientists, or it is being consumed by industry at an ever-increasing rate and filled with plastic and so on. So essentially we live in a pretty unpleasant and narrow experience. Now, the consequence of this is that few of us really get the capacity to act freely any longer. Our lives are programmed by the system. And this also applies particularly to politics. Again, remember, for Arendt, the paradigm of politics is the Greek city-state, where individuals stepped forth to argue and debate with others and formulate policy. Well, in the modern system, public debate of this character has been marginalised, and instead the main feature of politics today is, as she argues, government. And government is essentially administration and bureaucracy to kind of deliver processes that again are beyond the control of any given individual. And this, for Arendt, is a very serious loss, because remember that according to her, we disclose human reality, what we mean to be human, through our political action. Consequently, if the scope for political action ever diminishes and is displaced instead by programmatic mechanisms of bureaucracy, then we are exposed ever less to revelatory insights in what it means to be a human being. In other words, as the scope for public action contracts, so does the range of human experience, so does our capacity to understand what it means to be human, and therefore we become, in a way, ever more impoverished in our life experiences. And in the sense that we gradually become elements in a mechanism, then obviously the conclusion, natural kind of corollary of this, is eventually we ourselves will be replaced by machines, because any machine can be a machine more successfully than a human being, and so ultimately we will be replaced by the very machines that our lives have come to approximate in practice anyway. So as you'll see, this is quite a pessimistic scenario that Arendt paints in her book. Is there any here grounds for optimism at all? Well, to conclude, I will simply say that I think there is some grounds to be a little less pessimistic than she is. And the point I would make is that her distinction between labour, work and action is obviously excessively rigid and to that degree false. All human endeavour, I think, includes all three forms of action. When we are in our jobs, the very jobs that she characterises as mere kind of functional job holder society, in all of our jobs, yes, we labour. We do relatively repetitive, relatively meaningless, interchangeable actions to keep the machine running. Yes, so all jobs involve labour. But I think also most jobs also involve a degree of work, where work, if you remember, is kind of directed human endeavour towards achieving a target or goal. Many of us will have targets or goals in our jobs, and we will seek to realise them. I don't think it's a caricature to say that that's a reality. Thirdly, action, of course, also takes place in our jobs. In our jobs, we will often have to articulate what we're doing. We'll often have to explain to others. We'll often have to win over people. We'll discuss projects. We will interact and formulate policy through debate. You might think, for example, of the plethora of committees that we are all impacted upon in our daily work these days. Well, a committee is a sphere, maybe narrow, maybe limited, but still a sphere of human action, where we publicly interact with others and initiate things that can't be predicted. So to that degree, therefore, I think that our work lives are not simply the brutalised repetitive labour that Arendt does tend to characterise them as. The second thing I'd say, obviously, is that when we leave work, we don't simply go home and engage in the labour of consumption. There's also the scope, for example, for action in our, what you might call our private lives. All of us can, and often do, form a society. We can stand for election, from parish council up to MP. We can join a church. We can create a charity. We can compose a tweet. We might even, possibly, if you're particularly vain and self-indulgent, make a YouTube video. And so therefore I think that there is still scope for action in our lives, which somewhat belies the negative scenario that Arendt paints. So while I think that Hannah Arendt is indeed right to emphasise how the modern economic system sucks the meaning out of our lives, I think humans still have a restless propensity to put it back in again. And therefore I feel that the future is not necessarily so pessimistic as Arendt portrays it, but still I think we're all aware of the tendencies towards mass conformism and kind of regularized existences, and being conscious of that, we can perhaps to that degree be more ready to challenge those very processes. I hope that was of some informative help to some people out there. Thank you.